Hello again, boys and girls. It's so lovely to see you. I hope you've had a lovely half term. Now, we're going to read a bit more of our story, but first of all, let's see if you can remember who my friends are. So here, I've got Big Ted. Sat on his lap is Little Ted. Above me here is Henry, and here is Hamley, and you've guessed it, there's a new one today. This is Kerry Bear, and this one belongs to my daughter as well. She had lots of bears. I wonder if you've got lots of bears. Right, I'm going to put Kerry there so Kerry can listen nicely. Just that little bit so you can see Kerry. That's better. Okay, there are questions at the end. There's going to be a document on the Active Read part of the website for the Year 2s. Now, can you remember what happened last time? Judy and Mrs. Brown and Paddington were going on a shopping trip, and Paddington got into a bit of bother in the underground station. Okay, this chapter is called A Shopping Expedition. The man in the gentleman's outfitting department at Barkridge's, that's the shop, held Paddington's hat at arm's length between thumb and forefinger. He looked at it distastefully. "I take it the young gentleman will not be requiring this any more, madame," he said. "Oh, yes, I shall," said Paddington firmly. "I've always had that hat, ever since I was small." "But wouldn't you like a nice new one, Paddington?" said Mrs. Brown hastily. "For best?" Paddington thought for a moment. "I'll have one for worst, if you like," he said. "That's my best one." The salesman shuddered slightly, and averting his gaze, placed the offending article on the far end of the counter. "Albert," he beckoned to a youth who was hovering in the background, "see what we have in size 4 7/8. Albert began to rummage under the counter. "And now, while you're about it," said Mrs. Brown, "we'd like a nice warm coat for the winter, something like a duffel coat with toggles, so that he can do it up easily, I thought. And we'd also like a plastic raincoat for the summer." The salesman looked at her haughtily. He wasn't very fond of bears, and this one especially had been giving him queer looks ever since he'd mentioned his wretched hat. "Has Madam tried the bargain basement?" he began. "Or something in government surplus?" "No, I haven't," said Mrs. Brown hotly. "Government surplus, indeed. I've never heard of such a thing. Have you, Paddington?" "No," said Paddington, who had no idea what government surplus was. "Never." He stared hard at the man, who looked away uneasily. Paddington had a very persistent stare when he cared to use it. It was a very powerful stare, one which his Aunt Lucy had taught him, and which he kept for special occasions. Mrs. Brown pointed to a smart blue duffel coat with a red lining. "That looks the very thing," she said. The assistant gulped. "Yes, madame. Certainly, madame." He beckoned to Paddington. "Come this way, sir." Paddington followed the assistant, keeping about 2 feet behind him, and staring very hard. The back of the man's neck seemed to go a dull red, and he fingered his collar nervously. As they passed the hat counter, Albert, who lived in constant fear of his superior, and who had been watching the events with an open mouth, gave Paddington the thumbs-up sign. Paddington waved a paw. He was beginning to enjoy himself. He allowed the assistant to help him on with the coat, and then stood admiring himself in the mirror. It was the first coat he had ever had. In Peru, it had been very hot, and though his Aunt Lucy had made him wear a hat to prevent sunstroke, it had always been much too hot for a coat of any sort. He looked at himself in the mirror and was surprised to see, not one, but a long line of bears stretching away as far as the eye could see. In fact, everywhere he looked, there were bears, and they were all looking extremely smart. "Isn't the hood a trifle large?" asked Mrs. Brown anxiously. "Hoods are being worn large this year, madam," said the assistant. "It's the latest fashion." He was about to add that Paddington seemed to have rather large head anyway, but he changed his mind. Bears were rather unpredictable. You never quite knew what they were thinking, and this one in particular seemed to have a mind of his own. "Do you like it, Paddington?" asked Mrs. Brown. Paddington gave up counting bears in the mirror and turned around to look at the back view. I think it's the nicest coat I've ever seen, he said, after a moment's thought. Mrs. Brown and the assistant heaved a sigh of relief. Good, said Mrs. Brown. That's settled then. Now, there's just the question of a hat and a plastic coat. She walked over to the hat counter where Albert, who could still hardly take his admiring eyes off Paddington, had arranged a huge pile of hats. There were bowler hats, sun hats, trilby hats, berets, and even a very small top hat. Mrs. Brown eyed them doubtfully. Well, it's difficult, she said, looking at Paddington. It's largely a question of his ears. They stick out. You could cut some holes for them, said Albert. The assistant froze with a glance. Cut a hole in a Barkridge's hat, he exclaimed. I've never heard of such a thing. Paddington turned and stared at him. The assistant's voice trailed off. I'll go and fetch my scissors, he said in a quiet voice. I don't think that'll be necessary at all, said Mrs. Brown hurriedly. It's not as if he had to go to work in the city, so he doesn't want anything too smart. I think this woolen berry would be very nice. The one with a pom-pom on top. The green will go well with his new coat, and it'll stretch so that he can pull it down over his ears when he gets cold. Everyone agreed that Paddington looked very smart, and Mrs. Brown looked for a plastic mackintosh. He trotted off to have another look at himself in the mirror. He found the berry was a little difficult to raise, as his ears kept the bottom half firmly in place. But by pulling on the pom-pom, he could make it stretch quite a long way, which was almost as good. It meant, too, that he could be polite without getting his ears cold. The assistant wanted to wrap the duffel coat for him, but after a lot of fuss, it was agreed that even though it was a warm day, he could wear it. Paddington felt very proud of himself and was anxious to see if other people noticed. After shaking hands with Albert, Paddington gave the assistant one more long, hard stare. The unfortunate man collapsed into a chair and began mopping his brow as Mrs. Brown led the way out through the door. Barkridge's was a large shop, and it even had its own escalator as well as several lifts. Mrs. Brown hesitated at the door and then took Paddington's paw firmly in her hand and led him towards the lift. She'd had enough of escalators for one day. But to Paddington, everything was new, or almost everything, and he liked trying strange things. After a few seconds, he decided quite differently that he preferred riding on an escalator. They were nice and smooth, but lifts, to start with, it was full of people carrying parcels, and all so busy they had no time to notice a small bear. One woman even rested her shopping bag on his head and seemed quite surprised when Paddington pushed it off. Then suddenly, half of him seemed to fall away, while the other half stayed where it was. Just as he got used to that feeling, the second half of him caught up again and even overtook the first half before the doors opened. It did that 4 times on the way down, and Paddington was glad when the man in charge said it was at the ground floor, and Mrs. Brown led him out. She looked at him closely. "Oh dear, Paddington, you look quite pale," she said. "Are you all right?" "I feel sick," said Paddington. "I don't like lifts. I wish I hadn't had such a big breakfast." "Oh dear," said Mrs. Brown. She looked around. Judy, who had gone off to do some shopping on her own, was nowhere to be seen. "Will you be all right sitting here for a few minutes while I go off and find Judy?" she asked. Paddington sank down to his case, looking very mournful. Even the pom-pom on his hat seemed limp. I don't know whether I shall be all right," he said, "but I'll do my best." "I'll be as quick as I can," said Mrs. Brown. "Then we can take a taxi home for lunch." Paddington groaned. "Oh, poor Paddington," said Mrs. Brown. "You must be feeling bad if you don't want any lunch." At the word lunch again, Paddington closed his eyes and gave an even louder groan. Mrs. Brown tiptoed away. Paddington kept his eyes closed for several minutes, and then as he began to feel better, he gradually became aware that every now and then a nice cool draught of air blew over his face. He opened one eye carefully to see where it was coming from, and noticed for the first time that he was sitting near the main entrance to the shop. He opened his other eye and decided to investigate. If he stayed just outside the glass door, he could still see Mrs. Brown and Judy when they came. And then, as he bent down to pick up his suitcase, everything suddenly went black. "Oh dear," thought Paddington, "now all the lights have gone out." He began groping his way with outstretched paws towards the door. He gave a push where he thought it ought to be, but nothing happened. He tried moving along the wall a little way and gave another push. This time it did move. The door seemed to have a strong spring on it, and he had to push hard to make it open, but eventually there was a gap big enough for him to squeeze through. It clanged shut behind him, and Paddington was disappointed to find it was just as dark inside as it had been in the shop. Just as dark outside as it had been in the shop. He began to wish he'd stayed where he was. He turned round and tried to find the door, but it seemed to have disappeared. He decided it might be easier if he got down on his paws and crawled. He went a little way like this, and then his head came up against something hard. He tried to push it to one side with his paw, and it moved slightly, so he pushed it again. Suddenly there was a noise like thunder, and before he knew where he was, a whole mountain of things began to fall on him. It felt as if the whole sky had fallen in. Everything went quiet, and he lay where he was for a few minutes with his eyes tightly shut, hardly daring to breathe. From a long way away, he could hear voices, and once or twice it sounded as if someone was banging on a window. He opened one eye carefully, and then was surprised to find the light had come on again. At least, sheepishly, he pushed the hood of his duffel coat up over his head. They hadn't gone out at all. His hood must have fallen over his head when he bent down in the shop to pick up his suitcase. Paddington sat up and looked around to see where he was. He felt much better now. Somewhat to his astonishment, he found he was sitting in a small room, in the middle of which was a great pile of tins and basins and bowls. He rubbed his eyes and stared round-eyed at the sight. Behind him there was a wall with a door in it, and in front of him there was a very large window. On the other side of the window there was a large crowd of people, pushing one another and pointing in his direction. Paddington decided with pleasure that they must be pointing at him. He stood up with difficulty, because it was hard standing up straight on top of a lot of tins, and he pulled the pom-pom on his hat as high as it would go. A cheer went up from the crowd. Paddington gave a bow, waved several times, and then started to examine all the damage all around him. For a moment he wasn't quite sure where he was. Then he came to himself. Instead of going out into the street, he must have opened a door leading to one of the shop windows. Paddington was an observant bear, and since he had arrived in London, he'd noticed lots of these shop windows. They were very interesting. They always had so many things in them to look at. Once he'd seen a man working in one, piling tins and cans and boxes on top of each other to make a pyramid. He remembered deciding at the time what a nice job that would be. Okay, we're going to leave it there. Poor old Paddington. He seems to be getting into a lot of trouble, doesn't he, Kerry? Okay, here are this week's questions. Why did Albert, the salesman's assistant, give Paddington a thumbs up? Question 2. Why hadn't Paddington ever worn a coat before? Question 3. What do you think was happening when Paddington was counting bears in the mirror? Now, Paddington decided to wait outside for Mrs. Brown and Judy. Why couldn't he see anything when he bent down to pick up his suitcase? Okay, that's all the questions for this week. I hope you have a super week, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Bye from all of us. Bye.